Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. Has the Bible Belt bust? What now for Christian conservatives in an increasingly liberal nation? Bringing old enemies in from the cold, we discuss President Obama's foreign policy legacy. And has Harper Lee's new book killed a classic? Has the religious right lost its rights? In recent weeks, LGBT activists have made huge gains in same-sex marriage against business owners who discriminate on religious grounds. So where does conservative Christianity go from here? Should it fight for religious liberty or embrace a changing nation? Well, as usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams are joining us once again. Armstrong, where do you think the right should go from here?
Well, listen, you know the pendulum of history and the pendulum of time, it swings. Nothing remains the same. What was cool today may be fodder next year. Just like we removed the Confederate flag recently, it may become a symbol that may go up in 20 years. That's just the pendulum of history in any place. But I think what conservatives have to do is learn from the gay movement where they humanize the individuals. How can you discriminate? How can you be such against a person because of choice that they're making, exercising their free will? And the businesses that don't necessarily support these same-sex marriages, that are contrary to their faith and the businesses that they have, they must put a human face on these businesses. It's not that we're against them. It just goes against our religious practices to embrace these kinds of things that we're being introduced to. So we got to humanize it. You got to show compassion and make them out to be human. Use the same tactics that this movement has used so successful.
And Jeffrey Robinson, do you think that the obligation on people who have a genuine objection to a lifestyle should be enforced?
Whoa. I mean, I was pretty much agreeing with Armstrong until he left it hanging there and didn't say exactly what they're supposed to do about it. Should people with a legitimate belief in something have the right to pass a law? Well, let's see. Let's pass a law that says if you're a florist and you genuinely believe in your heart of hearts that it is wrong to have same-sex marriage, and you receive an order for flowers from a couple having a same-sex marriage ceremony, that law will protect you from doing business with them. That's the same law that would protect, say, a diner owner from serving Armstrong and his family at the luncheonette counter. Wait a minute. No, absolutely not. Simply because you believe in something doesn't necessarily mean that you are right legally or constitutionally, and they are wrong on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of the Constitution.
Well, let's bring in now Dr. Phillip Bethancourt, who's Executive Vice President of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Where do you think the right should go now, Doctor?
When we look at the right at this point in American history, what we have to recognize is that we're right back where we started. We are at a situation where religious freedom is the key issue of the day in America, just like it was in our founding and as it's been throughout that. And so what we need to have now is a situation where churches and people of other faiths come together to champion why it is that they should be able to continue to practice their faith Sunday all the way through Saturday, and to live out those convictions in a way that allows them to bring their faith into the public square and to be a respected member of society, and to be the kind of voice and servants for the cause of Christ and for the sake of the gospel that our Bible calls us to be.
The proportion of people who are white Christians, which I know is a sort of demographic term that politicians tend to use, is growing ever smaller. So if you apply the democratic principles of the majority view prevails, then they just have to lump it, don't they?
Well, what we see here is it seems as if there is a shift from an expectation that of a religious right that's a moral majority into what now seems to be an ever clearer moral minority. That doesn't mean that we're losing in terms of influence. It certainly doesn't mean we're losing in terms of our goal of sharing the good news of Jesus with people. But what it means is that our mission field is changing all around us. Our culture is changing all around us. We have situations where it's no longer beneficial in many cities and communities for somebody to identify as a Christian, even though they don't really believe the faith, just from a nominal standpoint, in order to have a cultural acceptance or to have some advantage in society. And so what that means is it's bad news for America, but it's actually good news for American churches, because those that are going to remain in the faith and live according to those convictions are those who genuinely believe them and want to have those convictions shape everything that they do in public life.
No. That's utter claptrap, double-speak, nonsense. It's the same argument that they have been making time and time again, way back to the old moral majority of the 60s. It's nonsense. The fact is, in 2003, when Massachusetts passed the same-sex marriage law, the religious right, and I shouldn't say that, the conservative right, I don't want to make this a religious issue. The conservative right warned all sorts of terrible things would happen. They said same-sex marriage makes the concept of husband and wife irrelevant to your marriage. Same-sex marriage reduces the worth of your marriage. Your marriage will be forced to abide by the social strictures of same-sex privilege. It's all utter nonsense. After they passed that law in Massachusetts, nothing happened. Gloom and doom did not happen. The sky did not fall in. You have religious freedom is protected by the First Amendment. Dr. Bethancourt, your sensibilities are not. Deal with it.
Armstrong, there are stats around, and I know stats can mislead, but 1 in 5 Americans, I read, are now religiously unaffiliated. That's just a reality.
Listen, you know, I sometimes I listen to Jeffrey. It sends chills down my spine because for many reasons. But you know, let me just say, just because people don't identify that they're not religious, because sometimes what they see religion as something that is very divisive, something that is organized, something that is very manipulative. But if you ask people, do they believe in God? And they believe that the 10 Commandments and all his commandments are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. Overwhelmingly, the majority of Americans would say yes. I think when you talk about this issue of the Christian right and religious conservatives, are they in the minority? Listen, moral striving, right and wrong would never be in the minority. No matter how many laws and how many ordinances that will pass, their ministers and their families in this country, as much as they celebrate the freedom and the free will of people in this country, they will never believe that same-sex marriages are morally right. They will accept it because that's free will. Let me finish. They will never accept it. They will never accept, just like murder and rape and anything else that is deemed as a sin, will never be morally accepted. Now, you can change the laws and the ordinances and do whatever you want, but time will dictate. So when you open up Pandora's box, where does this go? Are you going to want men now wanting to have multiple wives on polygamy? Are you not going to want reduce the age of the man-boy relationship? Until these issues play out in the sphere of America to see just what the damage may be as a result of passing these laws and these ordinances, only time will tell how long these laws will last and how long before they change.
What claptrap, what garbage, what utter nonsense. This is the same argument that they've been making. Nothing happened after Massachusetts passed the law. Nothing. Your marriage, my marriage, has not been affected by it in the least. And what's more, you say it has to do with right and wrong. Who's right and wrong? You're right and wrong, Philip Bethancourt's right and wrong, or mine right and wrong?
Commandment.
Well, hang on.
God's law.
Hang on a sec, guys. Time out, because I want to bring Mr. Bethancourt back in here. Can I ask you particularly about the right and wrong of somebody who runs a business and apparently, under this new principle, will be obliged to serve or allow a gay couple to stay in their hotel or make a cake for their wedding. Now, do you see that as something that people can live with, or do you think there will be legal challenges to that principle?
Let me give you an example. One of our Southern Baptist church members in the state of Washington runs a flower shop there, and she had serviced a gay couple for over a decade, had become relatively close friends with them over that period of time. But when one of those men came into her store and said, "We're going to be married and we would love for you to do the flowers at this wedding," she said, "You know, I've been serving you for a decade, but my religious convictions don't make me feel comfortable with doing that. And so let me recommend to you some other florists that are here in the area in order to do that." And so she'd been serving them for a decade, not discriminating against them, but she was not willing to violate her conscience. Now, the state of Washington, in response to that, has done an investigation of her, and she is now facing fines and penalties of $135,000 for not performing this activity. Well, and when you look at that, you just have to wonder, in a society when there are so many who would be willing to serve in these special, restricted, and minimal things directly associated with wedding service, vendoring, and those types of things, that we can find some way to make those accommodations to protect other people's conscience, because it's not a carte blanche discrimination. So when
Jeffrey, thank you, Doctor. Jeffrey, that's ridiculous, isn't it? 130 grand fine.
And what would happen? What would happen if it was a luncheonette and they refused to allow a black man to sit at that luncheonette counter? We've been through this before, and I love it when Phillip Bethancourt says, "Oh well, you know, there's a woman who says." I'm not a homophobe. I have black friends. Yeah, and I'm not an anti-Semite. I have Jewish friends. And I'm not a racist. I have black friends. We have fought this battle before. The arguments that he's come up with are the exact same arguments, word for word, to deny women the right to vote and to deny Armstrong to sit at a lunch counter in the South. You know, Armstrong, are you old enough to remember whites-only water fountains? This is disgusting. This is homophobia, and this is hidden in the robes of religion. Your religious freedom are protected by the First Amendment. I might remind both of you that we have a country where there is a separation of church and state. The Founding Fathers were very specific in not putting the word God into the Constitution, not putting the word Bible into the Constitution, because they understood very well the ramifications of the church influencing government. That's why they left Europe. That's why they left England. They came here for religious freedom reasons, and by God, that should be upheld by everybody, even the religious right.
Armstrong?
Listen, the mindset of Jeffrey, he's so anti-faith, he's so anti-God, he's so locked into his way of thinking. And all he can do is point to as if racism, as if what we're talking about now has some comparative to racism. That kind of mindset and that kind of thinking is very dangerous. It's that kind of thinking that goes overboard in this country. And I'm willing to tell you that in a few years from now, this will correct itself and right itself. And these people who have a right to say no, because it goes against their faith and their belief. It's not that they're anti anyone, but they have a conscience, as the pastor just spoke about, and they have a right. Just like they have free will, they have their free will to say no. And no, that person should not have been fined $135,000. She showed kindness in trying to find another florist that would come in and take care of the needs of that couple. And you want to punish her to the tune of $150,000? It's outrageous.
Phillip Bethancourt, do you think this is something that the new incoming president next year will need to address? So strong is the feeling?
Absolutely. And I think you're already finding that on the campaign trail as presidential candidates are marking themselves out. You have a situation where all of them are recognizing the dangers and threats to religious liberty and the need to preserve those. And I think that makes this a very important election, not least of which because of the fact that this coming president will likely be appointing several Supreme Court judges who will have jurisdiction over issues related to that. And so it's a conversation that needs to happen in the country. And I find it very interesting, for example, that Jeffrey did not answer your question about whether $135,000 is overboard, because what we're saying here is that the government did not give us our conscience. Therefore, the government does not have authority over the conscience. And when he tries to do these non sequiturs about lunch counters and things like that, Christians like us don't even take that argument seriously, because nobody's arguing for across-the-board discrimination of LGBT people or any others. What we're saying is that in certain situations like this, when it's directly connected to a wedding and a marriage ceremony, that there is a conscience issue that needs to be respected for people of faith.
Dr. Phillip Bethancourt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, on Roku, and on Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com/US. An historic deal done with Iran and a Cuban embassy to open in Washington, D.C. In recent months, President Obama has brought old enemies in from the cold. Proof, he says, that diplomacy can work. But what legacy will he leave on the international stage? First, let's speak to Dr. James D. Boys, a historian and lecturer on American politics. Dr. Boys has also written a book on President Clinton's foreign policy legacy. How do you think President Obama's legacy will compare?
I think it's very interesting, to be honest with you, Martin. If you look at where President Obama was just, say, 2 years ago, his foreign policy legacy would have been rather patchy. I think most people internationally have been somewhat disappointed by his term in office until, say, 2012, 14, for example. His first term was very much focused upon righting what he saw was the overstretch of the previous administration. So pulling out of Iraq, pulling out of Afghanistan, failing to close the camp at Guantanamo Bay. However, I think what we've seen in the last 18 months certainly is what this administration would see as being a rather formidable legacy. The idea that Washington has discovered that you need to make peace with your enemies, not your friends. So we've seen deals to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba, for example. We've seen the breakthrough this weekend with Iran. There's also talk that President Obama could well visit Vietnam before the end of his term in office. So I think that if you start putting those three issues together, then you have a very different foreign policy legacy than many people would have imagined just 18 months ago, I think.
The proof, though, will be in the success, particularly of that Iranian deal, don't you think? I mean, a lot of the critics are lining up to say we are sceptical. We do not believe that Iran will be prevented from creating a nuclear weapon of some kind.
You're absolutely right. And of course, one can think back to the Clinton years and a not dissimilar deal that was struck with the North Koreans with regard to trying to limit and curtail their nuclear expeditions. Of course, that came to nothing, and there were great disappointments within Bill Clinton's administration about the lack of a breakthrough with the North Koreans during that time in office. So there is a historical parallel there. We are, of course, only in the first hours after a deal has been announced. It must be recognised that it hasn't been agreed upon. This deal will have an awful long way to go just in Washington, D.C. alone, quite frankly. There's no doubt that it's going to have an awful lot of criticism on Capitol Hill. It's going to have ramifications for Hillary Clinton. Her team, people like Jake Sullivan, for example, are already talking about her deal in putting all this together in the first term. Very much, I think, trying to see some way of linking Hillary Clinton to this breakthrough deal to try and up the ante effectively and show Hillary Clinton as being someone who is part of an overall American master plan with regard to grand strategy in the 21st century. So this is an announcement which is going to run and have ramifications not only for this administration, but arguably for the next as well.
Well, let's bring in Jeffrey Robinson in New York and Armstrong Williams in Washington. Armstrong, do you think this Iran deal is worth having?
Listen, the devil is in the details. Obviously, the Iranians are not going to agree to random inspections. The Iranians don't come to the table with the best of intentions when you understand the rhetoric that still comes out of Iran and still shouting death to America. How can you even negotiate with someone who constantly shouts death to America? Obviously, we really don't know what's in the details until you actually read the 100 pages. But I do think that the president is desperate for a foreign policy legacy. And you asked the question about his legacy. I mean, if we go back to the Arab Spring, where he miserably failed, we go back to pulling troops out of Iraq, which he has to revisit, which we left them in a bloodbath. And now we're trying to go back and correct and try to reassert ourselves, particularly all the lives that we lost and the territories that we were able to conquer, all lost as a result of that. You look at Libya, you look at Syria, those places are disastrous. He certainly has no relationship with Netanyahu in Israel. In the Middle East is very skeptical. Look at Saudi Arabia. Even Saudi Arabia did not even attend his summit at Camp David here recently. Yes, the president is gambling. Whether these gamblings are paying off or not, what is he doing? He's building in nuclear proliferation to where all these Middle Eastern Arab countries become nuclear because they have to defend themselves against an Iran that they don't trust. One of the things he's doing, he's uniting many of these Arab countries, used to be solidly with Israel, and they're very public about it now. It's a risk that he takes. Obviously, his foreign policy right now, as far as I'm concerned, is a D minus. Can he go up? Is it worth the risk of trusting the devil, which I see as Iran? Only time in history will tell.
Jeffrey, he needs a big win, doesn't he? A big success to balance out some of those earlier questionable scores?
Well, those questionable scores are all on the name of George W. Bush. I mean, he had to clean up the mess that Bush left, and every one of the things that Armstrong mentioned is down to Bush. I know. I pretty much agree with Dr. Boyce. I think that what happens if you look back to all of the post-war presidents, especially the two-term presidents, the last 2 years of their second term is generally devoted to foreign policy because they understand that's where their legacy is. What I would like to know, and Dr. Boyce certainly would have an opinion on this, is how long it takes to fairly assess that. We look at Richard Nixon, for example, who was brilliant in the SALT talks with Brezhnev, but that's not his foreign legacy. His foreign legacy is opening China. How long does it actually take before history sets everything right and we can pretty much cement a legacy? It may be 10 or 15 years, 20 years, 25 years.
Well, I tell you what I do think is fascinating, particularly about this administration, is that one of the structural problems, if I can be so bold, with the American presidency is that whilst the president is limited to 2 terms, his second term is very often cowed by the idea of wanting to get his vice president elected. So the idea that you can do as you will because you're beyond the will of the voter in the second term is perhaps something of a mistake. Whereas what we see with Barack Obama, I think, is a degree to which he can go out on a limb and say, let's negotiate with the Iranians. And vitally, I think, something we haven't really talked about is let's negotiate with Cuba and restore diplomatic relations there. Because, of course, with Cuba, the great problem is not just dealing with the Castro regime, but the vital interplay between domestic and foreign policy, by which I mean that all-important vote in Cuba. So if you want to become president, you don't really want to alienate those huge electoral college votes in the Sunshine State. So the fact that neither Biden, it would appear, nor Barack Obama certainly will be on the ballot come November 2016, very much, I think, opens up the idea that you can negotiate and deal with Cuba without a potential domestic blowback.
Sure, but I mean, let me put it to Armstrong. This president isn't a complete dove, is he? Because, I mean, he's still sending drones around the world, probably as we speak, and if necessarily, killing people with them.
Well, he's certainly unbound. He's certainly bold. There's no doubt about that. But I do think if the events of the past 3 weeks shape President Obama's foreign policy legacy, it likely will be as, and I want to say this in the most respectful way, I think it's going to be painfully reluctant warrior and accidental diplomat.
If I could ask each of you, what do you think, Armstrong, in terms of kind or critical will be the end judgment, just in a word, on President Obama?
Critical, without a doubt.
Jeffrey?
Yes.
No, it's in reflection. Of course, it's always in proportion to other people. And when you look at George H. Bush or George W. Bush, you realize what a disaster that was. By contrast, Barack Obama will be remembered very kindly.
James Boyce?
Yeah, I think as long as the deal with Iran goes somewhere, then that will lead to a far kinder reflection than would have otherwise been the case.
Dr. Boyce, thank you very much. Next, it was released to a fanfare, Harper Lee's second novel, thought to be lost, but now found and published in 70 countries with 2 million copies printed in the US alone. The original draft that became the classic To Kill a Mockingbird has been met with a mixed reception. Should the author have remained a one-hit wonder? Well, let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong. Jeffrey, what do you make of all this fuss?
I'm slightly saddened by it. I think that if Harper Lee was Corpus Mentis, and there's some doubt that she is, it might have been different. If this were actually a new novel, it might have been different. This was the first draft of one of the great American classics. I mean, when you talk about the great American novel, you talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, you talk about Catcher in the Rye, and maybe you talk about Gone with the Wind. That's about it. I mean, those are the 3 that you hold up. for her to publish a book that she did not intend to publish because it was rewritten to become To Kill a Mockingbird defies what Hemingway always advised writers. If it's not finished, don't publish it.
Armstrong, what do you make of this?
I actually think it's wonderful. Many people went to law school as a result of reading Atticus, and if anybody followed the book and read it very closely, there was no doubt that Atticus was always had instances of racism. In fact, even during the entire courtroom, it was never even about Tom and his character. You knew nothing about his family, his children, his life. It was all about Atticus and these poor white people. It was always the focus. And for her to write a book, which could have been written long ago, to introduce him at every now and then attending a Ku Klux Klan meeting, and even his daughter Scott, who the book talks about her 20 years later, and facing some of the hard facts of some of the things that her father used to say and some of the examples. Listen, you have to consider the period this in. I would find it difficult for most people not to have racism in their heart, but you have to give him credit. He defended him. He didn't even defend him by choice. He was drafted. He did not volunteer to defend Tom. It was almost he was put in a predicament where he had no choice but to defend him. So it was anything benevolent. I don't know why people are so shocked. We've had scholars for decades writing about the fact that Atticus was racist. This is nothing new, and I think it really plays into what's going on now with Charleston, Ferguson, Baltimore, that these issues are at the forefront, which really brings and put this book in its proper context. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it's a debate that's worth having, and I think the book should do well. Yes.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks once again for being with us this week. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku, and on Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.